AP 120, Lab 15, Topics, Female Reproductive System. All right, here is a view of our female reproductive model. See quite a few different structures here. We have the ovary, the uterine tube, the uterus, the vagina, labium minus, labium majus, clitoris. Here's the urinary bladder. That's just some of the structures you'll need to know for this model. All right, the female internal anatomy includes the ovary, the uterine tube, formerly known as the fallopian tube, but we will call it the uterine tube, the uterus, now seen in cross-section, and the vagina, now seen in cross-section. So the ovaries are very important because they house the primordial follicles. These primordial follicles have the oocytes, the egg cells, that were produced way back when the female was a fetus. And approximately once every 28 days, a primordial follicle will mature slowly in order to eventually lead to ovulation. The external or superficial portion of the ovary is called the cortex. This is where you'll find the follicles. And the internal portion, the deep portion, is the medulla. There's mostly blood vessels and nerves. So the primordial follicle will mature into a primary follicle where the cells surrounding the oocyte grow and divide. This will then lead to the secondary follicle, even bigger, more cells have divided and fluid space starts to develop. And then finally you get the mature follicle, very large, has a fluid-filled area called the antrum, and has, of course, the oocyte. During ovulation, the mature follicle will travel to the surface of the ovary and rupture, releasing the oocyte plus some cells surrounding it that are protecting and nurturing the oocyte. Then the remains of the mature follicle will turn into corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is a yellowish structure. It's very important because it produces a variety of hormones. But then eventually over time, corpus luteum will break down into the corpus albicans, which is basically a tiny bit of scar tissue. All right, so here is the ovary again, ovary. Then we have coming off of it the uterine tube that carries the oocyte to the uterus. You'll note that there's these little finger-like structures coming off the uterine tube. These are called the fimbriae. So here is the fimbriae adjacent to the ovary, and then the long uterine tube leading to the uterus. When we come to the uterus itself, you can break the uterus up into two main regions. You have the body of the uterus, which is the major portion of the uterus, and then you have the cervix, a small inferior portion of the uterus that pushes slightly into the vaginal space. You can also look at the uterus in terms of the layers of the uterine wall, with the outermost external layer being the perimetrium, then the middle layer, myometrium, that's filled with smooth muscle tissue, very important for producing the contractions during labor to expel the fetus. And then the inner lining of the uterus is the endometrium, which can be broken into two substructures, stratum functionalis and stratum basalis. So again, here is our cross-section of the uterus. So if we go by layers, that thin outermost layer is the perimetrium. Then the thick middle layer is the myometrium. So this is all myometrium. And then that thin inner layer here is the endometrium that's lining the inside of the uterus adjacent to the uterine cavity. And of course, down here is the vagina. The vulva is the term for the external female genitalia. It includes the mons pubis, which is the amount of fat over the pubic symphysis. The labia majora, the thicker folds of skin, and I'll have pubic hair on them, and labia minora, the thinner inner folds of skin that are hairless. and that form a vestibule around the urethral and vaginal openings and a hood over the clitoris. And then, of course, the clitoris, which is a small erectile sensory organ. So again, here is the female's external genitalia, mons pubis above the pubic symphysis. Here is the clitoris. You have labium minus is one, labia minora is both of them, the inner folds of skin. Here's the vaginal orifice, here's the urethral orifice. There may be a hymen partially covering the vaginal orifice. And then, of course, on the outside is the labium majus for one side, or labia majora for both of the folds of skin that are going to protect this structure. Here on our model, here is the vaginal orifice, here's the urethra, the clitoris, the labium minus and labium majus. Over here, the mons pubis. So again, you can either use the singular or plural forms of these two terms. Just try to stick with one and don't mix and match them. So labium minus or labia minora, labium majus or labia majora, one or the other. And that is it for this part of Lab 15.